So hi, everyone. It's very nice to meet you. My name's Maggie Moore. I'm a graduate assistant at Penn Career Services. I'm also a second-year MBA student here at Wharton. And prior to that, I worked at Bain Company as a management consultant. Today, as I'm sure you all know, we'll be talking about the consulting case interview. I'm going to give kind of a broad overview of the case interview to start, and then we'll really spend the majority of the time in an example case, which is the high quality bottles case from a case book that I find to be really helpful. Before I get going, I just want to caveat this by saying that, despite my background, all the information I'll be talking through today is my own, personal opinion and should not be reflective of any particular company's perspective on interviewing. And I also just want to point out that we have a ton of our other Penn Career Services advisors here on the call today. So I saw Anne, Laura, Dustin, I think there's a couple others. So thank you all for joining, and they're all going to be great resources for you all as you prepare for the case interview. So without further ado, also I should also mention, we're currently recording the session. The session will be posted for those of you that are going to want to watch it back. But I'll ask you to, if you have any Q&A, please just put it in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if we have time at the end, I'll get to some of those before the session ends. All right. So let me get going with here just a kind of overview of the consulting case interview. So ultimately, the goal of a case interview is to understand how you think, right? What I mean by that is I can break that down into about 4 or 5 components. The first one I call business sense. So are you able to think logically and creatively through a business problem, justify your assumptions, and reach a rational conclusion? What I mean by this is I don't want you to be a textbook that's regurgitating some sort of framework that you read online, right? I want you to be someone that's really thinking thoughtfully, and again, I said creatively about the problem that we're solving together at hand, because that's ultimately what a case interview is. You're justifying any assumptions that we're making with your own personal experience oftentimes. And then the conclusion that you're reaching, it might not be the quote unquote correct answer that we have in the case book, but it's rational given kind of all of the logic that you've laid out through to date. So again, that's what we're calling this business sense. And ultimately, that's going to be the most important aspect that I'm looking for in a case interview, really how you think through a business problem. The second thing as an interviewer I'm looking for is your quantitative skill set. So can you manipulate numbers effectively, but then more importantly, can you draw conclusions from your analysis? So it's going to be important, you're not able to use a calculator or Excel in most case interviews, that you can do some basic mental math, right? Get me to the right answer. And if you drop a 0 here or there or make a small error, that's fine, right? But do you have facility in general with numbers? And then, like I said, more importantly, can you look at that number and based on the question that we're trying to answer, can you put that number in the context of the case and say what it means? Right? At the end of the day, that's going to be much more important to your job as a consultant, right? We've got computers and Excel in our day-to-day lives. Okay. So business sense, that quantitative skill set. The third one here I find students are not as familiar with. So this one I like to call coachability. And what I mean by this is, can you actually take and incorporate real-time feedback without getting kind of flustered? So maintaining your composure and your enthusiasm for solving the problem. So oftentimes your interviewer is going to redirect you or, kind of push you in a direction that maybe you weren't planning to go in the case. And that's oftentimes just because they need to get to the next question and we only have 30 minutes to run your case, right? But if you as a student can't take that feedback, right, and move forward in that new direction that your interviewer is pushing you towards without getting flustered or feeling like you've done something wrong, that's actually an indicator for us that you're not going to be able to take feedback in your day-to-day job anyway. And consulting at the end of the day is an apprenticeship business. You're getting feedback every minute of every day. So we need to make sure you can take that feedback and ultimately be what we like to call coachable. And the last one here, so the things that I'm testing, last one I'm testing here is just ultimately your preparation. The case interview is not something you can show up to cold and succeed at. You need to have put in your time and effort to understand, how do I approach this thing, right? And then show up to your interview to be able to do well. Okay, so I'm also testing just your ability to put in the work to be able to be successful, which is really necessary in your job in consulting. Okay, so what I'm looking for, again, at a high level: business sense, quantitative skills, coachability, and preparation. So let's talk a little bit more about what actually the case interview is, right? There's two types of case interviews, and I put these two types on a spectrum because I'll talk about them separately, but really any case can fall kind of in any combination of these two types of interviews. So the two types of interviews are interviewer and interviewee led. What I mean here is who is driving the case forward, right? Who's really leading the problem solving versus answering the questions. So an interviewer-led case is going to be a case in which the interviewer is going to read you a prompt. So someone like me, an employee of the firm, is going to read you a prompt and then ask you specific questions about that prompt to guide you through your analysis, right? And importantly here, you may or may not be required to develop, a full-on framework. And we'll talk more about what a framework looks like later on. But you may or may not be required to put together this kind of high-level overview of how you would approach the business problem. I might just ask you a series of questions that I need you to answer. So that's one type of interview. The other type of interview is an interviewee-led case. And this is one in which, me, the employee of the firm, is going to read you the prompt, but then you as the student are ultimately expected to drive the entire analysis. So you'll put together that high-level framework, and you'll say, the place I'd like to start first is here. And you'll ask that initial question, and then you'll get an answer to that piece of your framework, and you'll move to the next piece of your framework. So you're ultimately driving the case forward, and the interviewer is kind of along for the ride, and there to provide additional information if you ask for it. So the reason why I think it's important to highlight that there's these two different types of interviews is because you're going to prepare for them differently, right? And so it's important to understand from your firm, is this a firm that usually asks more interviewer-led cases or interviewee-led cases? In my experience, firms, especially in that first round interview, are leaning more towards interviewer-led cases, so the one I have on the left here, just because it's a little bit more standardized and a little bit easier to do in a shorter amount of time. But again, it's going to be highly firm dependent. The case we're going to walk through today is a little bit more interviewer-led, but kind of in the middle, so it should give you a sense of both types of cases. Okay. The last piece of overview I want to give around the case interview is really just how it's structured, and two things I think are really important to remember. I say that a case has direction and choreography. So the graphic I have up here on the slide really just shows the core components of the case interview. There's that initial prompt where the interviewer is going to read you some sort of business question, and you as the interviewee are going to respond, right, by asking some clarifying questions. That's that second point. And then ultimately developing a framework, again, depending on the type of case, that you're going to use to answer the question that was asked. You're then going to walk through in step 3, the kind of meat of the case, which is you walking through your framework or answering the questions that are asked of you to get the data points you need in order to finally, step 4 here, make a recommendation. Answer the question that we asked you in step 1. Now, the two important things that I mentioned here, the direction and the choreography. What I mean by direction is that each piece of information that you're working through in this case, I always want you to think about, how does that get me from prompt to recommendation? How does it further support or challenge my current hypothesis of whether to agree with, recommending we enter the market or not, right? To agree with the idea that we should use this strategy to boost our revenues or not, right? We always want to take each question that we're answering and each piece of information in the context of, how does it get me closer to my recommendation? That's what I mean by direction. We're always moving left to right. What I mean by choreography is that there's it's kind of like a dance, right? There's kind of expected steps and phrases that are going to be happening in the case interview that if you don't know the choreography, you're going to get a little lost and you're going to fumble. So I'll give you an example. When the interviewer reads the prompt, after that, it's pretty common for a student to say something like, wow, that's such an interesting case. I've got a couple clarifying questions. Do you mind if I ask those now? Right? Or as you get to the recommendation, it's very common that a recommendation is going to have a recommendation, a summary of your analysis, some risks, and some next steps. And if you don't know that ahead of time, if you're not prepared for those types of steps, that choreography, you're going to be at a disadvantage just because you didn't know what the expectations were. So remembering to focus on that direction to push the case forward and then prepare those types of expected steps and phrases will just allow you to be more comfortable and ultimately be able to focus on what is the core of the case, which is answering the question itself. Now, my recommendation around direction and choreography, if you find that this is something you don't really understand or you're kind of confused as to what I'm talking about, I highly recommend you go and you watch on the websites of some of the larger consulting firms. They'll have some videos of example case interviews. So they'll have like a staged interview with an interviewer and an interviewee walking through a case. You'll be able to pick up on some of those steps and phrases that I'm talking about if you just watch some of those example interviews. So you can always watch those on 2 times speed. I think it's a great way to start preparing for your case interview. Okay. So that's what I had as kind of a high level overview. Again, the goal here was not to bring you entirely up to speed on the case interview, because I think the best way to understand how to walk through a case interview is to actually do an example of one. So that's what we'll spend the next 30 to 45 minutes or so of our time doing. And the way I'm going to do this is we've got an example case that we'll use. For each stage of the case, I'll walk through some tips and tricks, and then I'll walk through an example answer for this particular case. Again, if any questions come up, please drop them in that Q&A, and I'll get to them at the end if we have time. Okay? All right. So let's jump into it. High quality bottles. So like I had mentioned, this case is going to be a little bit of a mix between interviewer and interviewee led. We're going to develop that framework, but ultimately our interviewer has a couple math questions that we need us to answer. This case is a combination of new market entry as well as profitability. Okay. A case type is going to be a general overview business question that we're going to be asking with a specific situation in mind. New market entry and profitability tend to be quite common first round interview case types. So I encourage you to review those frameworks. You can do so on Management Consulted, which is a free resource we provide to all Penn students. And I'll talk more about that at the end. But let's jump into it. So at the start of a case, your interviewer is going to read a prompt. While the interviewer is reading that prompt, there's a couple things you need to be doing. First, you need to be taking notes. When you take notes while your interviewer is speaking, what you want to be using is a blank sheet of printer paper. I highly recommend you take your notes on the left, turn your paper horizontally, and take your notes on the left 1/4 of the page. Leave that right 3/4 page blank for developing your framework. Your notes should be pretty detailed. I don't want you to write down verbatim everything I say, but you want to capture the key points that the interviewer is saying, because oftentimes you won't actually see the prompt visually. You'll just have to listen to it. Once you've taken down the notes and I've finished reading you the prompt, you're going to summarize the prompt in your own words to confirm your understanding. Okay. The point here is just to make sure you didn't miss anything. And oftentimes your interviewer will correct you if you did. Once you've summarized the prompt, you then have the option for asking some clarifying questions. And what's really important here is that we're actually asking clarifying questions. We're not getting into the meat of the case yet. This is your time to ask a question, for example, if you don't understand the business model of the case that we're talking about. Let's say it's a private equity case and you don't know what private equity is. This is your time to ask and get that information so it doesn't penalize you throughout the case. The other question I always recommend students ask is about a numerical goal for the case. And what I mean by this is, let's say we've said in the case our goal is to boost revenues, right? You're basically asking by how much? Is there a specific goal we need to boost revenues by $50 million or 15% as an example? It's important to get that number early on because it will allow you when you're doing your math stages of the question to be able to say, hey, I just calculated we're only going to be able to boost our revenues by $40 million. So this opportunity is not good enough, right? If you didn't ask that up front, you wouldn't be able to make that analysis later on. Again, if you have other clarifying questions, things you didn't understand, feel free to ask them here, but let's not get too detailed because we'll save that for the rest of the case. Excuse me. Once you've asked your clarifying questions, you're going to go ahead and take a minute to develop your framework. Again, in some cases, so I've run a couple cases where I actually don't have a student develop a framework. I'll just let you know that we're going to jump into an initial question and you don't need a framework. But very often, you're going to pull together a framework. This is going to take you about 1 minute and no more than 2 minutes to do. And we'll talk about this more on the next slide of what a framework is and how it should look. But first, what I'm going to do is read you the prompt for our case today. I'll read it as if I was an interviewer, and then I'll give you an example of a summary that a student might give back and some of those example questions. If you've got a piece of paper in front of you, I highly encourage you just to play along with me, practice taking some of those notes and coming up with your example questions for yourself. Okay. Again, I'm actually going to put the prompt on the screen here for our purposes, but in most instances, you're not going to see the prompt. You're just going to listen to the prompt. So let me go ahead and read us through the prompt now. After successfully servicing large beverage companies over the last 20 years, our client, the CEO of High Quality Bottles, which is a small plastics manufacturing and bottling company, wants to expand into the hospitality and leisure space. Specifically, she wants High Quality Bottles to supply local hotel chains with bottled toiletries like shampoos, conditioners, body wash, and lotions. High Quality Bottles already has the interest of local hotel chains in their hometown, and they need your help in identifying if this business is worth pursuing. So our key question today is, how would you approach evaluating this market for the client? All right. So what I'm now going to do is flip into the interviewer mode, so flip into the student mode, and I'm going to give you my example summary and some example questions I would ask. So as the student, I might say something like, great, thanks so much for the case. This is super exciting. I stay in hotels all the time and love using the hotel soap. So I'm really interested in how this whole industry works. So just to make sure I have everything straight, our client is a small plastics and bottles manufacturer that currently works primarily with large beverage companies, and they're looking to enter the local hotel market. We'd be supplying bottles for shampoos, soaps, conditioners, anything that's in the bathroom to these local hotels. And our key question is understanding, how should we approach evaluating this market? Is that right? Okay, so I quickly summarized the case. I put it in my own words, right? I added some of my own language just to make sure it really made sense to me, right? And then my clarifying questions, I might ask something like, so just to make sure I'm understanding, our company, High Quality Bottles, doesn't actually make any beverages or make any soaps. We're just manufacturing the bottles themselves and then selling them to the companies that make the soaps and the beverages. Is that right? Right, so again, some of those smaller nitty-gritty clarification questions to make sure you understand who are our suppliers, who are our customers, what's the exact product we make. Those types of clarifications are really important here so that it doesn't come up halfway through the case that you misunderstood our business model, right? And then again, I might ask about a specific goal. So I might say something like, it sounds like our goal in entering this market is to improve, our revenues and our profitability. Is there a specific metric that we're using to understand success for entering a market like this? Okay. So that's that kind of phase one, prompt, summary, clarifying questions, and then we jump into this framework. All right. So moving into the framework, you would now say something like, great, can I have a minute or two to gather my thoughts? And your interviewer is going to say, sure. So let's move on to some tips and tricks for developing that framework. Okay. So first, your framework should actually answer the question that I'm asking you. The question I asked you here is, how do I approach evaluating this market, right? Oftentimes, the number one mistake I see students make is they anticipate the question that they think I'm going to ask, and they come up with a framework to answer that question, but they don't actually answer the question I'm asking you. And the reason why I think this happens is because you've read all the case books, you've practiced with a specific framework that you want to use, essentially no matter what I say. And that's your number one ticket to not moving forward in the interview process, okay? So don't just use an off-the-shelf framework because you have it memorized and feel comfortable with it. Oftentimes, it's going to have some information in there that's not going to be relevant to the current situation we're focusing on, and that'll be a ding from the interview perspective. Similarly, don't focus on information that's not relevant. So if I asked you about boosting revenues, don't give me a whole bucket on costs, right? Really answer the question that I'm asking. Secondly, your bucket should be MECE. MECE is a term that we use all the time in consulting. It means mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So what do I mean by this? A bucket is essentially a subsection of your framework. So if a framework is the set of information you need to know in order to understand a question, essentially the path that you're going to use to solve the case, right? A bucket is one group of information, one set of that group of information. These buckets should not overlap with one another. And I'll show you an example when we talk about the example framework here. But bucket 1 and bucket 2 shouldn't have anything to do with each other. They should be answering distinct pieces of the question. And then collectively exhaustive means that buckets 1, 2, and 3 should be all the information that you need in order to answer this question, right? There shouldn't be any pieces of information that you need to know that aren't within your framework, okay? Mutually exclusive, so distinct buckets, and collectively exhaustive, no missing information. Okay. The last piece that's really important here is that we need to clearly articulate our framework. So in these days, especially when most first round interviews are virtual, I actually can't see the framework that you've developed. And so what I need you to be able to do is explain your framework to me so that I can almost visualize it in my own head, right? And I think the best way to do that is to use transition phrases. So you might tell me up front, there's 3 buckets that I'd like to look into. The first bucket is, give me the name of that bucket, walk me through that bucket. Then say the second bucket is, give me the name of that bucket, walk me through the bucket. Make it really clear what those delineations are so that I could almost write your framework myself on a piece of paper in front of me, even though I can't see it. Similarly, I'd like you to explain to me why you need to know the information that you're laying out. So if you say, let's say we're doing a profitability case, and you say, I need to know, the variable costs. Sure, it's implied that I need the variable costs in order to calculate the overall profitability, but tell me more. I'd like to understand variable costs so that we can blah, 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 right? Finish that sentence with me for every piece of information. It just gives me better insight into your thinking and tells me that, again, you're not just pulling on a framework that you read in a textbook. You're really thinking about how each piece of information is going to help you ultimately make a recommendation. Okay. Finally here, push the case forward. So once you've finished explaining your framework to me, I want you to say, the place I'd like to start with is this, because X, Y, Z. And your interviewer very likely is going to want to start somewhere else. You're going to say, I'd like to start with the market size. And they're going to say, actually, let's start with the competitive landscape. Right? And that doesn't really matter. What matters to me is that you're thinking about how am I going to logically answer this question? And you're pushing the case forward. You're not just waiting for me as the interviewer to tell you where to go. Okay? That's going to be a theme throughout this. Push the case forward. Answer the question, put it in context, and say, where do I want to go next? And I've listed down here a couple of the common frameworks to review, I think, especially for a first round interview. Again, it's going to depend on the firm itself, but I think very often a profitability case is going to come up, either in terms of increasing revenues, reducing costs, or both. And then some sort of entering a new market, launching a new product, M&A is also very common. So there's lots of other frameworks. You can check them out on Management Consulted, but these are the 2 kind of general buckets that you really need to be comfortable with to be successful. Okay. So let's actually walk through an example framework and talk about what all of this means. So if you remember, we're looking at high quality bottles. They're thinking about entering this new market in the local hotel industry. And I'm going to explain my framework to you as if I was a student. So you are all the interviewer, I'm the student, and I'm going to walk you through my framework. Okay. All right, so there's three pieces of information ultimately that I'd like to understand. The first two I've grouped under just understanding more about this new market, learning more about what is the hotel toiletry bottle industry look like. And the third has more to do with our current capabilities and whether or not that will allow us to be successful in this new market. So first, under this kind of new market hotel toiletry bottles industry, the first thing I want to understand ultimately is our opportunity size. So first, what's the market size today? How big is the local hotel toiletry bottle industry? And is it growing or not, right? This will allow me to understand whether this is a sizable opportunity for us both today and into the future. So I'd want to ultimately understand what percentage of this market are we going to be able to capture today and go forward. I've listed here a couple pieces of information that I might need to know in order to do this. So thinking about how many hotels are in this local market, how many rooms are in each hotel, how many guests are we having, and how many bottles are those guests using, right? That'll allow me to get an understanding of that total market opportunity. The second piece within this opportunity size bucket is then understanding the profitability. So once I know our revenues, right, I really need to understand our costs and understand, is this a profitable industry? So from a cost perspective, I'd want to understand both our variable costs, so things like the materials we're going to need to make these bottles, if we need any new manufacturing capabilities, the distribution costs, as well as our kind of fixed costs. So I'm thinking about things like labor and rent, if there's any incremental costs there. And then finally, if there's any costs that I'm going to need to start up to get started in entering this new market. So if there's new equipment we need to buy, new trainings we need to do for our employees, et cetera. All that's going to allow me to do is take our market size, subtract off our costs and understand ultimately what's our opportunity size in entering this new market. The second bucket that I've got under this, again, like talking about the new market, is really understanding the customer needs. So first, what's the competitive landscape in this market today, right? Who are the current suppliers in this industry and how consolidated are they? This will allow me to understand, is it going to be realistic for us to enter this market and capture a bunch of market share or not, right? More consolidated means it's going to be harder for me to enter. The second thing I'd want to understand under this customer needs bucket is more about the hotels themselves. So it was really interesting to me in the prompt, it said something like the hotels themselves have already reached out to us. That would indicate to me that the hotels are unsatisfied with their current suppliers for some reason today. So I want to understand why. Is it their price? Is it their quality? Is it something about timeliness or stockouts? Right? Understanding the current pain points will allow us to be able to make an assessment of whether we can actually solve those for the customers or if we're going to fall into the same traps ourselves. So ultimately, why us? So those are my first two buckets, opportunity size and customer needs. My third bucket has to do with the current capabilities today to see whether or not we can enter. So what I'm thinking about there is first from a manufacturing perspective, do we have the capacity and labor to be able to start manufacturing these bottles, or are we going to need to fund a new plant or some new labor in order to do that? Do we have new equipment, et cetera? And then from a financing perspective, do we have the capital to be able to fund these startup costs, right? Or are we going to need to take on some new debt or issue new equity? And the other thing I'm thinking about here that could be interesting is exploring maybe a partnership with another company. So I'm thinking like Dove, like a soap or a shampoo brand. Could we make a partnership and actually deliver, rather than just the bottles of soap to the hotels, but like the full bottle plus soap product? Just something to consider. So when I think about where to go first, I'd really like to focus on this opportunity size, because this will allow us to understand just at a basic level, is this industry going to be profitable for us now and into the future? Okay. So I'll pause there. You see how I walked through each bucket? I really clearly laid out, here's the bucket I'm talking about. Here's the information I'd want to know and why. And then I re-emphasized, and that will allow me to understand X, Y, Z before I moved on to the next bucket. Okay. All right. Again, each framework is going to look different. You might have thought of something else that you'd want to talk about, something I might have on here you wouldn't have on your framework. That's fine. There's just important pieces of information that really can't be lost. So market size, profitability, competitive landscape, and kind of synergies and manufacturing startup costs. are going to be the things we really can't leave off here. Okay. I know I'm talking fast and I'm talking a lot at you. Again, this recording is going to be posted online. I highly recommend you go through and kind of work through the case yourself and then watch the recording again and see to what extent your answers were aligned with the sample answers I'm putting up here. Okay. All right. So I just said I wanted to jump into the market size and my interviewer agreed. So my interviewer has now asked me, what's the market size of supplying hotel toiletries in this region in dollars in year one? So let's talk a little bit about the approach to market sizing questions and math questions more generally. Whenever you get one of these math questions, my number one recommendation is to ask for a moment just to think through your approach. So it's totally fine once I ask this question for you as the student to say, do you mind if I have 15 seconds to think through my approach? Again, we don't want to take more than 15 to 30 seconds here, but it's just going to allow you to put your kind of thoughts onto paper and be more structured when you're actually telling me how you want to approach this problem. So always feel free, like you can take time. And if your interviewer ever says, no, just do your best, that's fine too, right? At least you asked. Okay, so take a moment to think through your approach. For these math equations, what I want you to do first is write down your approach in words. So actually write down an equation with the specific categories of information that you're going to be multiplying or dividing or adding or whatever. And make sure you include your units. And the reason why that's going to be important is, again, ultimately, if you think about what I'm trying to learn from you as an interviewer, I'm trying to learn how you think. So at the end of the day, it's much more important to me if you can lay out a structure of here's the information I'm going to need to be able to multiply, add, divide to get to your final market size. Lay that out first. That's 50 to 75% of the answer. And then do the math. Okay. Get credit, essentially, for that thinking before you jump into the math. All right. So once you've laid out your approach, very importantly, I need you to walk through your analysis out loud. It's extremely frustrating as an interviewer when a student lays out their approach and then just goes heads down, does all the math, and comes up and says the answer is 5 and the correct answer is 50 million, right? I have no idea how you went from a great approach to the wrong answer. As opposed to if you walk me through each step and you say, okay, first I'm going to multiply this by this and that equals this, and then I'm going to add this and divide by this, I can catch you if you make any mistakes and kind of put you back on the right track, right? It saves both of us time. And it actually shows me that the mistakes that you might have made were minor as opposed to a major mistake if you put your heads down and come up with 5, right? So walk through your thinking out loud. Excuse me. Then ask for information that you're lacking, right? Or make a reasonable assumption. So if I've walked you through all my information, this is everything I want to be able to do. You can say, let's take this example. I'm going to need to know the number of hotels in this local area. I might say something like, do we have any information on the number of hotels in the region? My interviewer might say, yes, it's 40. Or you might say, no, feel free to make an assumption. And so then I might think through an assumption. And the important thing here that I mentioned earlier is I need you to justify your assumption. So you might say something like, well, if I think about Philadelphia, which is probably equal in size to the region that we're talking about, I can think of 5 hotels within a 5-block radius of my apartment. So if I multiply that out to the entirety of Philly, I might be thinking about something in the realm of 50 hotels. You see how I just justified an assumption that I was going to make? I didn't just pull 50 out of nowhere. I used my prior information to make an assumption. The interviewer might say, actually, let's use 75. And then you go with 75. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that you're using that logic to justify the assumption that you're making. Okay. So ask for information you're lacking or make a reasonable assumption. Do the math out loud. We talked about this one. No calculators or Excel. Rounding. Only round in situations where the number is particularly difficult and very close to a round number. So I run a case where we get an answer that's like $798.56. That's a horrible number to do further work with. I'm going to round that to 800. Okay. What I don't want you to do is take a number like 724 and round it to 700, right? 724 isn't a horrible number to work with. At least you could round it to 725 if you needed it to be a little bit easier, right? But ultimately, we want to round in situations where we're getting close to the end. It's a really tough number. We're really close to a nicer number, and not just to make our lives easier. Okay. You can also always say, do you mind if I round? And your interviewer might say yes, or your interviewer might say no. Okay. And just follow their guidance. All right. And then as usual, put your answer in the context of the case. So once you get to your market size, you want to say, all right, a $10 billion market size. This seems really big, especially given the fact that our current revenues are only $500,000 or something like that, right? Put your answer in the context of the case that allows us to say, does this information point us towards a yes or no recommendation, ultimately? Okay. And then just a preparation tip. Many market sizing questions can be answered starting with either the US population or the US number of US households. If you read any sort of case in point or case prep book, they're going to walk through these two starting points in detail, along with some recommended segmentations like by age. These are great, and I highly recommend you memorize some of these key numbers. But at the end of the day, remember, not all market sizing questions can be answered this way. The one we're about to do cannot. And you need to be able to listen to the question and come up with a market size formula based on the question being asked. Again, not just based on a framework that you memorized from a textbook. Okay. All right, so let's walk through the example here. So our question again is, what's the market size of supplying hotel toiletries in this region in dollars in year one? Now, what I've got on the left-hand side of this table here is an example of my written out in words equation, okay? This is pretty long and complex, right? And yours might look differently. You might approach this instead of, I'm approaching this from number of occupied rooms. You might approach this from number of people staying at the hotel, okay? Both approaches are valid, and both approaches should ultimately get you towards a ballpark same answer, okay? It's just going to be about which information you're asking for from your interviewer. So again, what I've done here is I've laid out in words, what are the steps I'm going to take to get to my market size in dollars? And importantly, you'll notice I've kept my units really explicit here. So I've started with the number of hotels, and I'm multiplying by the number of rooms per hotel, and that gives me the total number of rooms in the town. Being this explicit will make sure we don't get lost as we're walking through our math later on, okay? And the second units thing to remember is ultimately in this question, I'm asking for a market size in dollars in year one. You could also imagine a situation where I'm asking for a market size in number of bottles, right? Both of those are valid questions. They're also different questions. So you want to make sure you're keeping track of your units so you're answering the question being asked. Okay. So again, what I would have done is the interviewer would have asked me this question. I would have said, do you mind if I take 15 seconds to collect my thoughts? They would have said yes. I would have written something like this down on my paper. Again, yours might look different. Then I would come back up and I would say, great. So my thought process here is that I'm going to first take the number of hotels that are in the region, figure out the number of rooms on average that there are per hotel, and that'll get me the total number of rooms in the area. The thing I'm not quite sure about is, not every room is occupied all the time. So I want to take off some percentage of those rooms that are not going to be occupied. Maybe it's like 80%. So that I've got at any given time the total number of rooms that are going to be occupied in these hotels in our region. Then what I want to think about is how many guests are staying there every week and how many bottles our guests are using each day. That'll get me the total number of bottles that we're using per week. Then all I have to do is convert that into weeks per year. And then the price per bottle will give me my total annual market size. Okay. Again, you can work through this problem differently. This is just one example. So then I might ask for, great, do you have any information on some of the metrics that I mentioned? For example, the number of hotel rooms on average per hotel, the number of hotels, the estimate on the average percentage of rooms occupied, et cetera. And my interviewer might give me some of that information. Then ultimately, I'm going to walk through the math. So I'll show you on the right-hand side here. This is the math. Again, if you're doing this case on your own later on, I recommend you walk through the math yourself. It's pretty straightforward. And that'll ultimately get you to a market size of about $900,000. And again, the most important thing is we put that market size in context. So we say, okay, it's about a $900,000 market annually in this region. So I might ask something like, do we have any information on how much revenue HQB generates today? I'd just like to understand whether this is a sizable opportunity given our current book of business, right? Like, let's say HQB is a $50 billion company. I don't think they are because we said they were a small company, but just go with me in this example. A $900,000 market size opportunity is really small in comparison, right? So we might be a little bit more concerned that maybe this is not worth potentially entering this market. On the flip side, maybe HQB is a $1 million business today. And so this is potentially up to, doubling our potential revenue size in the market, okay? So again, we want to put all of our numbers in context and explain, right, how this number is potentially going to help us make a recommendation. Yes or no? Okay. All right. So once we get to that market size, I've got two more kind of follow-on math questions here. It's very common that you'll have like one big math question and then one or two smaller math questions that'll use the information that you had previously or just build on it to give you some more information. So in this case, we're going to be talking about profit margin. This is an important equation that you should remember here. If you ever run into a situation where they've asked you about profit margin and you don't know what it is, feel free to ask. You can just say something like, would you mind reminding me what profit margin is in this case, right? They're not going to necessarily ding you for that, and it's more important that you ask so that you can answer the question effectively. So in this case, we're looking at what profit margin can HQB expect each year if it captured 100% of the market. So profit margin, just so we all know, is our profit divided by our revenue. So that's going to be our revenues minus our costs divided by our revenues. So I'm going to approach this in the same way. The first thing I'm going to do is ask for, 10, 15 seconds to collect my thoughts. I'm going to write down in words my equation. So in this case, I'm taking my revenue per bottle, which we already calculated, right? That's our market size, minus my variable costs per bottle. It's going to give me my gross profit per bottle. Multiply that by my bottles per year. That'll give me my total gross profit each year. I'm going to subtract off any fixed costs, right? That'll give me my annual profit. I can use that annual profit to get my profit margin. Okay. I'm going to explain that same thing like I just did to you all. I'm going to ask for the information that I'm missing. So in this case, I'm missing my cost information. So I'm going to ask, do we have any information on, our variable cost per bottle, right? So I'm thinking things like raw materials, distribution costs, et cetera. And then any fixed costs, I'm thinking things like rent, labor, et cetera. It's good to give some examples so that the interviewer has an understanding of what you're thinking of, right? And my interviewer in this case would give me the information I've got here on the left. Again, for time reasons, I'm not going to go through this one in depth in terms of the math itself. You can always check this one out later when you're doing it yourself. So that math information is going to be on the right-hand side here. And ultimately, I'm going to get to a profit margin of about 30%. And again, I'm going to take this number and I'm going to put it in context. So I might say something like, great, a 30% profit margin sounds pretty good to me, right? We're making some money, but I'm curious, do we have any information on HQB's average profit margin today so that I can have a better understanding of whether this is comparable to our current profit margins or not? Okay. All right. Our last math question here is a break-even question. And so break-even questions are very, very common. They're very common as a follow-up math question. So it's important to understand, what do we mean by a break-even question? A break-even question is talking about at what point in time, right? It's always a time question. Are we going to recoup our initial investment? So whenever we're entering in a new market, there's typically going to be some upfront costs that we're going to need to spend in order to just be able to enter the market. So for example, in this case, we need to buy some equipment in the first year. It's going to cost us about $500,000. And so our question is, in how many years are we going to break even? And how many years are we going to make up those costs, right? And so what it comes down to, and again, this is a very straightforward break-even question. You can make them more complicated, but at its core components, what it is we're going to take that initial cost and we're just going to divide it by our annual profit. And that's going to tell us how many years it will take for us on average to make up that initial cost. So in this case, we calculated in the previous question that our annual profit was about $260,000. So in this case, $500,000 divided by that 260 is going to give us about 2 years. So it'll take us about 2 years in order for our profits to have made up for that initial cost that we spent. So essentially, starting after 2 years, we will start making money, right, on this overall investment. Again, this is the simplest form of a break-even question. You can imagine a situation where my annual profits are different each year. That could make it a little bit more complicated. Okay. But again, remembering and understanding terms like profit margin and break even will just give you a little bit more confidence walking into the case interview. But if you ever run into a term that you're unfamiliar with, please just ask. Your interviewer will let you know. Okay. So now we made it through the math section, and I want to burn through the last two sections. The first is typically some sort of smaller brainstorming question. So this is going to be to push us back a little bit more in that creative mindset and just hear a little bit about how would you approach a question that's a little bit out there, right? So in this case, HQB is curious about other avenues that they could go in to boost revenue. What are some other opportunities for HQB to grow? So we're going to use a lot of the similar techniques that we did for that frameworks question. You're going to take a moment, as always, just ask for 10 or 15 seconds to think through your approach. If your interviewer says, no, just brainstorm, just spitball, that's fine. Do just that. But always, if you have the opportunity to, take a moment and come up with a structured response, just because you'll sound a little bit more polished and put together. So again, no more than 15 or 30 seconds for a question like this. You're going to provide a structured response with me-see buckets, just like we talked about. But because it's a brainstorming question, it does not need to be as fully fleshed out. So we're talking about 2 buckets with 2 to 3 bullet points under each. That's it. So let me give you an example from this case. We might think about, what are some other opportunities for HQB to grow? Well, we could think about it either in terms of their existing operations, so our operations with beverage companies, or new operations, so entering other new markets. So first, in terms of existing operations, we could expand into other beverage clients, right? So maybe we're working with water and we want to expand into juice. We could expand internationally, or we could potentially just build more plants, so make more of our current thing. In terms of our new operations, we could enter a totally new market, like aluminum cans or plastic bags or other plastic containers, right? Like Tupperwares and things like that, okay? So the point here is that we've got just a structured response, right? We have 2 buckets. They're me-see from one another, right? And we've got a couple ideas within each, okay? The goal here is just to show off that creativity. All right. And importantly, remember to answer the question that's being asked of you. So in this case, we were talking about boosting revenue. We're not talking about reducing costs. So be careful that you don't talk about, we could do some R&D to reduce our costs or source new materials, right? We're really focused on boosting revenue here. Common mistake I see for students. Okay. So lastly, our recommendation. So oftentimes you'll know you're at the end of the case when you're asked what we call an elevator question. So this is something like, you bump into the CEO of High Quality Bottles and she asks you, what have we found? Should we pursue the expansion? This is your opportunity really to make that recommendation and summarize all the great analysis that you've done. So as always, take 15 to 30 seconds to collect your thoughts in silence before you get going here. You're going to want to start with a clear recommendation, and I'll give you an example of this afterwards, but you're saying something like, I recommend XYZ. Summarize the analysis you conducted briefly. Don't go into too much depth, but you're essentially showing the evidence that you're using to support that recommendation. And then conclude with any risks that you might have of your recommendation and next steps for continued analysis. The point here is that you're showing you're thinking beyond just the case itself. So you're thinking, this assumption we made, for example, about 100% market share, that's a really big assumption. I would want to test that further before I make the recommendation to the client, right? You're just showing you that critical thinking a little bit further. So let's walk through an example. So again, you bump into the CEO of High Quality Bottles and she asks you, what should we do? So you start with that recommendation. I recommend that high quality bottles pursue the expansion into the local hotel toiletries bottle market because of the large market size and strong profit margins. With our current estimates, we calculated the annual market opportunity of $900,000, and we would achieve a 30% profit margin. With $500,000 in initial costs, we'd break even in 2 years of serving this market. Okay, so that's my brief summary, and it's essentially framed as a supporting facts of my recommendation. One risk of this analysis is that we assumed we'd capture 100% of the local market starting in the first year of entrance. This may not be true given that current suppliers might have ongoing contracts with hotels that don't end this year, right? Very valid risk. So as a next step, I might recommend we continue our conversations with some of these local hotels to build confidence in our assumption that we would capture 100% market share in the next year. Okay. Doesn't have to be anything groundbreaking, but we're just showing that, you can't answer this entire question in a 20-minute case interview. So what would you want to do next? Okay. So if I had to boil down everything I've talked about in the last hour to a couple key takeaways, places where I see students make the most mistakes, I would say first, always take the opportunity to take a moment and collect your thoughts before answering each question, right? This is going to allow you to just come up with a more structured and coherent response, which oftentimes is what the interviewer is looking for. Answer the question being asked, not the question that you think is being asked, right? Prepare those common frameworks and anticipate the questions that might be asked. But at the end of the day, listen to and be creative in your responses. This is solving a business problem together, right? It should be fun, hopefully. And you should have some new ideas that other people didn't think of, okay? And finally, push the case forward, okay? So put your answers in the context of the case, and ultimately always remember to think about how does this new piece of information inform your recommendation, okay? So that's all I had on the majority of the content. I'll end here with just a couple recommended resources. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of us from Career Services on the call today. Please make an appointment to come in with us via handshake. We can review your resume and cover letter. We can run a practice behavioral interview. That's another component of the consulting interview that we didn't talk about today. And then we can also run a practice case interview. Just to note, you are limited to 3 mock case interviews throughout our office every 6 months. So make sure to time them appropriately with your preparation and interview process. The other resource I always recommend you can find on our website is Management Consulted. This is essentially a free, huge repository of practice cases, math drills, and more video courses that walk through step-by-step what's a strong profitability case framework, what's a strong and new market entry framework. It's a really great preparation tool for you to just get the reps in. You can find that on our Career Services Consulting Communities page, along with a ton of other resources, including at some point this video.